And so now it's my pleasure to tell you about our speaker this morning. Apparently Mary knows most of the people on this call. I'm just kidding, but we've had a number say, I signed in to I saw Mary was speaking, so I signed up. So Mary Hiland, Ph.D., brings over 40 years of experience to nonprofit leaders. Mary's the author of Love Your Board, the Executive Director's Guide to Discovering the Sources of Board Troubles and What to Do About Them. She's also a contributor to four other nonprofit leadership books. Mary's the founder and host of the podcast, Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Mary earned her PhD in Human and Organizational Systems, focusing on nonprofit leadership and governance, and she has 3 master's degrees in related fields. We are excited to have her with us this morning. Thank you, Mary, for your willingness to share your wisdom, and I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all. Want to just quickly express my gratitude for all the work that you do as well, and the veterans in our families and our friends. So I'm going to screen share now. We okay with that? To get started, and here we go. You all know the drill on this, right? From the beginning. Okay, so we're going to go through this. We're going to have time for questions. The focus is to build a dynamic board executive director team, but I want to say that I know there are a lot of people here who are not executive directors. Maybe you're an aspiring executive director, which would be wonderful. Or maybe you're not, but you're have another position in nonprofit, or maybe you're even a board member. So I'm going to highlight most of what I'm talking about is relevant for a lot of different roles. So I'll try and highlight that for you, and hopefully you see that as we go along. So let's just get started. The objectives for today, and I'm going to move my little screen here so I can see, is I'm going to cover 4 key areas, some longer than others, to gain insights about, just really quickly set the context. What are the challenges for building a constructive relationship with a board and executive? What are those challenges? To understand the roles and responsibilities of the board versus the executive, how they're separate and how they overlap. This is one of the most in-demand questions that I get asked. We're going to get into the levels of trust and specific trust building strategies, and I have a giveaway for you about that. And then lastly, but not least, we're going to talk about 4 important strategies for building an effective board executive team. Now, these are strategies executives can use, but I think you're going to learn it as you go through, no matter what your role is. Anytime you're working with a group in an organization, these strategies and these insights are going to be relevant for you. So I hope you will look at it from that point of view. Okay, so the challenges that are unique to the board executive director relationship. Well, it's complex. I'm sure this is not rocket science for you, but it's really important for us to pause, I think, and think about what makes this hard. You're all very busy in your work. I'm sure you're doing more than you think you have even the capacity to do. But it's helpful to pause and reflect on and acknowledge that these things are not easy. There are challenges. So the complexity of the relationship is related to the fact that if you're the executive director and you need to build an effective relationship with your board, because your board can add huge value, is a huge strategic asset to your nonprofit. You may not think that from time to time, but it really, really is. And we know from research, boards make a big difference when they're effective. And you having a strong relationship with your board helps make it effective. So each individual on the board, though, is unique. You've got a group as a boss. Where else does that happen? It doesn't. So this is really difficult, but you need to get to know and be aware of the uniqueness of each individual, including you as the executive, but each of those board members. The organizational stage of development. I'm sure you're all aware that when it's a brand new organization, a lot of times the board members are friends and family. The dynamic is very different. They can be working on the operations of the organization, which frankly is not governing, and they should be governing, but that's just the reality. What people refer to as a working board, and I tell them all when I get the chance, all boards work. Let's get past that and get clear about the board's role versus a staff role, whether you're volunteering to do things in the operations. But your stage of development is going to influence that, and that makes the dynamics complex. The tenure that you have in key positions. How long have you been the executive? If you're on a board committee, you're staff to a board committee, how long have you been in that role? How long have the people been on the board? You know, when I did my research on the board chair executive relationship, I found board members who had been chairs of boards for 20 years. This is going to be really different than if you have a board chair that's turning over every year. Huge difference in your experience. Level of commitment, by that I mean, you know, kind of the amount of time you have to give. Are there board members who are there and have a good amount of time, or those who don't? And the level of knowledge. And I'm going to talk about this more later and what I mean by that and why that's important. The other thing is that referring to the executive director board relationship as a partnership is common, but it really is a misnomer. And the reason is that it doesn't acknowledge the power dynamics that are real and go on. Partnerships imply equality, and it isn't equal. The power dynamics are going to shift over time. If you're a brand new executive, you know, you have to kind of prove yourself sometimes. If you're very tenured executive, the board may be backing off a little bit and, you know, sort of giving you more rein than maybe you should have from time to time. But the ideal for a most effective relationship is that you have a strong board balanced with a strong executive director. And this would be true again for any board committees where you have a staff person serving on them. So that's really important. So, okay, so those are the key challenges in the relationship. Now let's move to the second thing we want to talk about this morning, which is the board of directors versus the executive director and other staff as well in terms of the roles and responsibilities. Now I want to just say that I use a leadership framework from time to time, and that's something that you can use to think about your role versus the board's role. And I think of boards, and being on a board is a leadership position, just like being an executive director is a leadership position. And based on my research and study, I've kind of condensed this down so it would be a little simpler for people to think of. And I don't have slides on this, but I want you to have this in mind as we go through these, that the functions of leadership fall in four big buckets, four big areas. The first is envisioning the future. And you want to be aspirational about that and think about, what do we want to create for our nonprofit as we advance our mission? The second bucket is know reality and respond. You know, we have to be grounded in the reality of our situation in our organizations and the reality of the world. This hit everybody in the face hard during COVID, but you have to know the reality and you have to respond. And so there's a tension for leaders between where you want to go and what you aspire to achieve and where you are. And together, the board executive need to work on how do we bridge that gap? What are the steps we're going to take to go from here to there? The third bucket is to engage and inspire others to act. You're not a leader if you don't have any followers. And this is where the board, of course, has a key role. And the executive and other staff all have key roles in inspiring and others to engage with your nonprofit and your mission. But individually, you know, as an executive, you don't have a lot of capacity for that. And your board is a huge lever for your nonprofit in doing that. So that's a way that your board adds a lot of value. And the fourth bucket is one that we don't talk about very often. And that is that leaders self-manage and self-reflect. We learn and we take action on what we learn, And for boards, that's particularly relevant because the self-management part is where all the board's responsibility is to build, and I'll talk more about this, build an effective team, build the board as an effective team. We know that boards that are most effective are teams, and that's qualitatively different than just a group of people sitting around the table. I think you all know that. And you're going to have teams in your organization in a variety of places. And so this applies to them too. When you have a team, you want to be clear on what your purpose is. You want to be clear on how you're going to organize to achieve that purpose. And that's where your board structure comes in, your meeting management. And you want to be clear about who needs to be in the room to achieve that purpose. So those are 4 key leadership functions, excuse me, that are really important for you to have in mind as you think about the board's role versus staff roles. So here's a very big overview of the board's role. The board's job is to lead to advance the mission. Now, executives out there, you're probably looking at that and saying, that's my job too. Well, there is overlap. So again, you know, the board's job is to help establish the vision and planning, implement strategic action plans that are relevant to the board's role. This is very specific. The board doesn't do the staff's job. Ensure resources. You know, people ask me, is the board's job is governing mean they have to fundraise? Well, you may not like me saying this, but not necessarily. The board's job is to ensure there are resources to advance your mission. And not all nonprofits need to fundraise. So stewardship, this is where they build and nurture relationships as well as steward the assets of the organization, and all the relationships you have, including, you know, social capital, all of that are assets. Hire and support the executive, inspire and engage others, we've talked about, and build the board as an effective team. This is the job of governing. This is the job of being a board member. For the executive, it's to lead and manage the day-to-day operations of the organization. So if I was going to say one thing to distinguish the roles, I would say board members never, ever get involved with the day-to-day operations of the organization as board members with their governing hat on. If they're doing that, they are volunteering as staff, and they are accountable to the executive director. Okay, so the executive has to implement the strategic plan as it relates to the operation, to the running of the organization, all of these things here, administration, HR, finance, fund development, the executive has a role, and obviously all the relationships, but also the relationship with the board. These are the things that are shared, and this is why it gets complicated. Board composition, recruitment, and orientation. Executives, you have a very important role in these things. Even if you think this is the board's job, it is, but you are part of the team and you have a role. Board development, the reason I have nudged here, board development is about how your board's getting better. It's not the recruitment only. It's how does your board get better? And you as the executive have a key role in asking questions, helping your board members be exposed to what it means to be an effective board, toward training and other things. So you can be a real nudge with your board and its development. Board member engagement, strategic planning, all of these things are things that you share with the board. And as a team, you're involved together in creating and doing for your organization. Hopefully this makes sense. Okay, so we have covered the complexity of the relationship. We've covered the distinction of the roles. Are there any key questions before we go on? I can't see hands for everybody because I only see a few of you. So, okay, well, we're going to have more chance for questions later. So let's go. And if you have one and we missed it, bring it up later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a really critical thing, and this is relevant to anyone who wants to build a relationship with anybody, but critical if you want to build an effective team. Now, this can be your staff team, but I'm talking about this mostly in terms of the board with the executive, building an effective leadership team for your nonprofit. Now, this is Patrick Lencioni's work. We're not going to go over all of this, but I want to just highlight that trust is the foundation. And so we're going to do a deeper dive into trust and what my research taught me about trust and how to build it. My experience is that people take trust for granted, not so much that they got high levels of trust in all their relationships, but that they think they know how to build it. And there's so much more to it than most people are aware of. So I want to give you a deeper dive here in that. So trust is the foundation of any effective team. You have to start there first. Okay, so what is trust? So I'd like you to put in the chat one word that you think defines trust for you. I'm going to wait a few minutes because this is really important. So what's the one word that defines trust for you? Okay, faith, transparency, confidence, safety, honesty, good things. Honesty, again, support, safe, integrity, reliability. Okay, good ideas. Well, one person hit the nail on the head. One of you did. Trust is a feeling. It is not a behavior. So the safety that you mentioned, if you have trust, you feel safe. It isn't trust itself, but trust is a feeling. It's in your gut, folks. You know whether you can trust somebody or you can't. And you don't know that because you've done some intellectual analysis. You've done it because of how it feels. Trust is, I didn't realize that was there. Okay, trust is confidence. It is the confidence that the other person or people have your best interests at heart. That's really the strong part of trust. Or the weaker part of trust is that at least they won't hurt you. So trust is a continuum going from very weak level of trust to a very strong, powerful level of trust. And we're going to talk more about that now. But it is confidence in the other person at some level. I hope that resonates with you. And this is so important for you all as leaders. You know, Stephen Covey, and this is the son, Stephen Covey, who wrote a book about trust, says that this is the key leadership competency of our times. You need to be an expert in building trust in all the relationships that you have in the workplace, particularly. Okay, so backing up a second, there are 5 ways that I found in my research that you build trust. 5 types of interactions with people. Now, these aren't the only ones, but I think you'll find that your interactions in the workplace are going to fall into these 5 categories. And these are one-on-one interactions, by the way, although in some cases these would relate to you relating to a group as well. So the first one is fact sharing. You know, now a lot of executives give their boards information. I want you to think about this in terms of how you are interacting with your board members and the board as a whole, or maybe with your team if you're not the executive director. Fact sharing, you give information, okay? That's fine and that's important to do. The next type of interaction is ideas sharing, and it's different than fact sharing because you're sharing an opinion, you're sharing your thought. You have to be a little more open to do this, don't you? Yeah, okay. Another type is knowledge sharing. And by this, I don't mean the idea sharing and the fact sharing, although you could think of them as knowledge sharing, but this is when you're sharing an experience of learning. So those of you who are here with a board member or with someone else on your team, you're doing this right now. You're knowledge sharing, and hopefully you'll interact and share your ideas about it after the fact to share what you learned with each other. Another type of interaction is give and take. This is when you are understanding the preferences or the needs of the other person, the style, and you're able to adapt and they are adapting to you. This is a higher level of interaction, and it takes a little bit more openness and knowledge about the other person. And finally, feelings. And this takes even more openness because you have to feel safe to share your feelings with someone else. But this is another type of interaction. I had an executive director and their board chair in my study, and there were many of them who were definitely at this level, but they used to talk about appreciating each other. And the executive felt comfortable sharing some challenges that she had, and how concerned she was and stressed she was. This is all about how to be open and sharing feelings. Okay, so how does this translate into understanding what trust is and how to build it? There are 3 levels of trust that I learned in my research, and they are cumulative. Okay, so this is the lowest level of trust. I call calculus-based trust. And in calculus-based trust, it's like you get in your car and you drive on the road, right? You trust that the people driving on the other side aren't going to come over the line. You don't know them. You don't know who they are, but you trust them. You trust them not to hurt you, right? So this is a very low level of trust, but it's critical. We couldn't function if we didn't have this trust. But you certainly want a higher level of trust in your working relationships. Now, this is where you make calculus-based trust, is you're making a choice about whether to trust this person and what are the risks of not trusting them. And I think that if you thought through your whole day, all the people you probably interact with, where you have calculus-based trust, just because you couldn't function if you didn't. But again, it's a very low level of trust, and you certainly want higher trust in your working relationships. Now, knowledge-based trust is the level of trust that you're most familiar with. This is the one where you think, well, I'm getting to know the person, so I trust them more the more I know about them, or not. You know, there's also the other side of distrust, but we're not talking about that. So this trust type is built by getting to know the person better and better. But there are 3 types of this kind of trust. And this is where you're probably most familiar with, based on your answers to the definition of trust, is communication-based trust. The trust is confidence, but it comes from the behavior of being honest, of having integrity. Contractual trust, I'm skipping the middle one for a second. Contractual trust, an example is about you do what you say you're going to do. You know, you trust people to do what they say they're going to do. And if they do, that helps build contractual trust. Competence trust is what I was talking about earlier in terms of what you are able to do, understanding your skills, knowing enough about you. And we're going to talk about this a lot more, executives, because this is really important. And this is important for any staff person, that people need to know your competence and the basis of your competence to trust you. You don't trust a plumber to come into your home and fix your electricity. You need to know that they're competent in what they're doing to trust them to do what you want them to do. So those 3 types are all about knowledge, though. You know the competence, you know the evidence of someone's competence. You have knowledge when you're experiencing them in communication. What are you learning about them? And that's true for contractual-based trust as well. Okay, the 3rd level of trust is the highest level of trust. And this may surprise you. It surprised me in my study, because this was getting more personal. And, you know, I've been around a long time, and I remember the years where it used to be that what's personal and professional kept separate. Well, I'm telling you today that that isn't. Now, when I say personal, I mean appropriately personal in the workplace. So it's appropriately personal, but you need to get personal. You need to get personal to build a team, to build that foundation of trust for an effective team. And that's true for you with your board members. So when you have identification-based trust, which is the highest level you can have, you've gone beyond knowing each other to identifying with each other. You know each other so well that you find the thing that you have in common. You know, what is it about your lives where you have some common ground? Yes, you may care about your mission. Yes, you have that experience in common, but this is at a more personal level. You identify with the person, you begin to act on his or her behalf. You are an advocate for them. This is when your board members know you, trust you, feel so confident. They're going to speak up for you, and you will speak up for them. And they may speak on behalf of your nonprofit, and you don't need to be there, kind of monitoring and coaching them. You trust they've got it. You build a collective identity. This is really important for an effective team. You are connected to each other. You understand what you have in common. You know, I did a board retreat not too long ago, facilitated one. And one of the services provided by this nonprofit was domestic violence counseling and shelter. And we said to the board members, okay, and the executive, let's go around the room and share why you personally are connected to this mission. And it was so powerful because several of the people in the room had personal experience with domestic violence, and they trusted each other enough to share it. And that created a huge, powerful bond for them. So that's how you can build a collective identity. It doesn't have to just be around the work you're doing together. It can be around who you are as people. When you have that, you know each other's strengths, you can build on those strengths, always better than trying to fix weaknesses. Those of you that have teams and people you're supervising, focus on their strengths. You're not necessarily going to fix their weaknesses. You may compensate for them, and that's something you do when you trust each other. So this is really important, but it's hard to get there with people. And the executives and the boards that I've worked with who have this level of trust are making powerful, powerful impact for their nonprofits. Okay, so just a couple of additional points about this. Trust building is cumulative, and it is stronger. And this is important because the giveaway I have for you is a trust building plan. It's going to help you identify what you can do in a targeted relationship where you want to build more trust. It has a list of lots of trust building behaviors that fit into these categories and these levels. But what we know from research is that trust is stronger if you're basing it on different trust building behaviors. You're not just doing one or two of the same things over and over again. So when you look at the trust building plan, you'll get what this means. You'll be much clearer about this. So don't forget to grab that, and I'll tell you how to do that at the end. Okay, we have one more segment on a different perspective about using strategies to build the relationship with your board, to build a team. But I wanted to pause in case there were questions at this point.
There is a question here, Mary. In the
Okay.
chat. There was two questions. One is, what if you don't have trust with a specific board member? What are your recommendations for how to approach that?
Okay. Well, my recommendation is to get the trust building action plan. It's a perfect tool for you because you can say, okay, here's the board member I want to build trust with. And you've got a list of trust building behaviors, and you can decide which of these will work with this person. The other thing about building trust where it isn't there is to go first. You know, it's hard when you don't have trust in a relationship, but go first. Do the behaviors that help you build trust. Show interest in the other person. Try to get to know them. You know, you may be at the calculus-based trust level. I've seen that, but you want to get into that knowledge level as soon as you can. Be interested in them. Ask them about themselves, and then you can share. And there's some other things I'm going to share in the next strategies too, which will all help build trust, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. So I hope that helps, but get that plan, you know, you'll know how in a minute. And yet there was another question.
The other question was related to operations. And you discussed earlier around board members staying in their lanes, essentially around operations. And if they were to dip into staff work, then they then report to the executive director in that role. The question is, what is the best way to approach a board member when they cross the line into operations?
Okay, well, there's a lot there. By the way, my book goes into a lot of this stuff in detail in terms of what to do about these kinds of board troubles, because this one is very typical, where board members or the board even as a whole sometimes is stepping over into the executive director's job or other people's jobs for that matter. The first thing is to make sure that the person that you are dealing with understands what their job is. How have they learned what governing is versus operations? And in many nonprofits, I find that I did a survey of boards and found that 75% of these board members, and there were lots of them that did my survey, said that they were never formally oriented to what it means to be a board member. Well, if you don't understand what your job is, going outside the boundaries of that job is going to happen. So that's step one. Secondly, remember we talked about, well, we're going to talk about managing expectations. Be clear. It's okay for you as an executive, and again, you need trust with your board to do this, but to assert your role. There were times when I was CEO that I had to say, wait a minute. Then this came up when one of my board members wanted to get involved in a personnel issue. I said, this is my job. And I said, I'm happy to report to you what I decide and what I do, but it's my job to do and to decide. So sometimes we just have to remind our board members gently and respectfully that that isn't part of their job as a board member. So that can be hard, but this is why proactively investing in trust building is so important, because when you have high trust, you're going to be able to have that conversation. The other thing you can do sometimes is partner, if you're the executive, partner with another board member who gets it and have them help you have that conversation. Your board chair particularly should know this and understand it and be your advocate when this happens. So there's lots more, but we don't have time to go into too much detail on this. But I think to start with respect, start with understanding your board member has good intentions. And a lot of times executives, if you're not helping your board have a strategic agenda from meeting to meeting, and there's a lot about meeting management also in my book, but if you're not doing that, your board members are going to flounder around and say, what can I do? Where can I help? And they'll go right into operations if they don't know what they should be doing as a board member to advance your mission, to advance your strategic goals. So there's a lot of strategies around making sure the board's got plenty of work on its own plate in roles that are appropriate for it. So you want to make sure you're keeping your board members busy where they need to be busy. Okay, so I'm going to move on, but we'll have more Q&A at the end if there's something we don't get to, okay? All right, so now we're going to talk about 4 strategies for building a dynamic board executive director team. And you'll see that a lot of these overlap with trust building, but we're coming at it from a different perspective. And I want to say that this is based on research. I'm a big proponent of evidence-based practice and what works. So as much as possible, I want to bring that to you as nonprofit leaders, what's been proven to work, what's worked for others. So you're not reinventing the wheel or having to test things that you don't know are going to work. Okay, so there's 4 factors that influence the relationship between the executive director and the board. And the first influencing factor, they're not in any particular order, that I'm going to talk about is alignment. If, go down to the 4th bullet, how often are you agreeing and disagreeing? If you're disagreeing a lot, there may be a clash of values, a clash of style, maybe your philosophy about how you do things isn't the same. So this requires some exploration, but it's really, really critical that you as an executive and your board are aligned in the strategic important things. Are you agreeing on the mission? And your mission is not what you do, your mission is why you do it, is the impact you're going to have. Are you in agreement about that? Of course, you want to be in agreement about the how you do it as well. But also you need to be in agreement on your strategic goals. And by that, I mean the results you're all trying to accomplish in the next couple of years that are advancing your mission. If you don't have those defined through whatever strategic planning process you use, or maybe you don't even have a strategic planning process, you just need to answer the question. If we're really successful in advancing our mission, what results are we going to accomplish together in the next few years? In a nutshell, that's what you and the board need to decide. And then executives, you have your job doing that, and the board has their job doing it, achieving those objectives. Okay, alignment, very important. Another influencing factor is communication. We just talked about how important that is for building trust. But as the executive communicating with the board and vice versa, you want to have a collective agreement. You know, you don't have unlimited capacity. Anybody who has unlimited capacity, put that in the chat. We don't have unlimited capacity. You need to negotiate with your board around communication. I know I had 15 board members. They all wanted a different type of executive report. Some wanted volumes and some said, just give me the bottom line bullets on one page. So I had to negotiate that because I didn't have the capacity to do 15 reports, and you don't either. So this is true for any staff person who's on this with us this morning, is that you need to think about how often to communicate, how comprehensive do you need to be, how specific, the timeliness. This is around like email. You know, if you don't respond to email in 24 hours, is somebody going to be pissed off? Excuse me. But who's the source of what kind of information? And how's it flowing from the executive to the board and back and forth and maybe down into committees to other staff? How does that happen? Because that's really important for you to work out with your board, is if there are staff working on committees and working with the board, how are they interacting with them to make sure you have boundaries and appropriateness there? And again, you want it to be individualized. This is how you'll build trust. What does everybody need in terms of communication, and what are the expectations? Now, once you know that, you sit down with the board and negotiate agreement around what they're going to get from you before each board meeting, how detailed it is. They actually have a legal responsibility to read it and be prepared for the board meeting. That's duty of care. So, and then no surprises. Now, this is hard to do if you don't have trust, because executives, I get it. You're not going to want to share the things you're worried about with your board chair, with your board executive committee, with your board as a whole, if you don't feel that you have strong trust there and can take that risk. And board members, you need to know this, that to the extent that you are not creating a safe space for your executive to share concerns, where you're not jumping all over them, where you're not jumping in to say, I'm going to fix it and do the work for you, where you are not judging the executive because they have doubts and aren't clear. You got to create that safety so that you can make sure you're all a part of the team and there is no surprises that are going to be a problem for you all. Okay, the third influencing factor, and I know I'm going fast on these, but I really want to give you lots of information. This is all about competence trust, folks. What are your resources for influence as an executive director or in any other position, those of you that aren't executives? What are your resources for influence? And some of those are your professional status in the sector. You know, how long have you been an executive? Your expertise, your education, your experience, all these things are executive assets. Are you full-time? How much time are you putting in? And don't work a zillion hours, executives. That doesn't help anybody if you get burned out. And if you're teaching the board that they can expect you to work more than is humanly reasonable, okay? So, but some executives, I'm working with an executive now whose job is part-time, but she works 40 hours a week, and it's really difficult, and they have some real problems. So they're not working effectively as a team because of that. Your network, your contacts, your access to information are all part of your assets. How quickly can you get new information? How quickly can you connect with people you may need to connect with in the community? Now, all these things are part of your assets. Now, executives, you may share all of this with your board when you're first getting hired, but this is a key tip for you. Chances are you don't share this when you get new board members, and you need to. Do you share your resume as part of the board packet when you hand that to a new board member? You want to build the confidence-based trust. You want to establish your executive assets with your board, with each and every board member. Make sure they have this information and make sure it's updated from time to time, because the more of this you have, the more competent you're perceived. And that's going to have your board have huge trust in you. And this goes both ways. Board members, if you've been on a board, if you have certain competencies and skills, you need to be sharing that not only with the executive, but with your fellow board members. You need to build your competence with the board too, to be an effective team together. And finally, this is about managing expectations. And there's no set formula. You need to work it out together. If your board member is overstepping boundaries and getting into the operations, you need to confront that proactively in order to clarify expectations and roles. And so this is where establishing objectively or bringing in an outside expert to help your board understand their roles, and then you can negotiate expectations. You're going to have the tools as an executive to remind them. Do you remember what so-and-so said? I know some of my executives say, well, I tell my board, do you remember what Mary said when she did this training? It gives you the tools you need to be able to have those conversations. Now, reciprocity is critical, builds trust. You want to make sure that each of you understands what your expectations are. On any team, you need to know who's doing what. Are we all crystal clear about that? And how are we being accountable to each other about it? And then you need to make sure that your actions are consistent with your agreements, circle back and confront the issues if they're not. So managing your expectations of each other is something you need to be proactive about, whether you're a board member, an executive, or even another staff person. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. I feel like it's been like a fire hose at you, but we have time for questions, I believe. You can reach out to me at mary@hilandconsulting.org. And this is where you get the Trust Building Action Plan. Go to hilandconsulting.org/trust building plan. Now, I want to note that in the handouts you may have gotten, the plan on this, I think, was left off. So you won't be able to get it if you don't have the correct URL. So the correct URL is Trust Building Plan. And I know that's going to be up on the website correctly, but if you have the handout of the slides, it's incorrect in the copy you probably have. So make a little note on there of that. And then, of course, you can always go out and grab, listen to my podcast. I have 140 episodes out there now, all about tips and strategies for being an effective nonprofit leader, and that's free. And if any of you feel you have something you want to share with other nonprofit leaders, things you've learned, please contact me. I'm happy to talk about the possibility of you being a guest. It's lots of fun. So, all right. Well, I'm here to answer your questions about anything that you want to know about working with the board, about being an effective board member, about governance, about building an effective team. So let me, I think it's okay if I stop share so we can see each other better. Is that okay, Kathy?
Yeah.
Yes, let me unspotlight you.
Okay, and I'm going to stop share.
Yeah.
Great.
So Mary, there were a few questions.
Good.
Let's see. One of the questions was, how often are you engaged directly with board of director teams? And what sort of response do you receive when you review roles?
Okay, so I want to clarify the first question. How frequently I'm engaged personally?
As a
With,
consultant or,
oh,
yes,
okay.
versus just, I think what the question is really board versus staff, because I think the perception is staff would be very open to understanding roles and staying in their calculus lanes,
Right.
versus board and how you approach them as a consultant, what you've seen in reaction.
Okay, so full disclosure, about 3 years ago, I started to move most of my business online. COVID was horrible, but convenient for me in that regard. So I do virtual coaching. I do coach board members, but not very often individually. I'm just mentioning that. I know that wasn't the question, but that can come up. But I mostly coach executives. I have an executive director group and am building a new one based on my book. But when executives need me to step in and do training with their boards, I do a board workshop on roles and responsibilities. And so I do that not as often as I used to do, but I'm available to do it. And so I would say, once or twice a month, I'm in front of a board talking about their roles and responsibilities. I'm very direct because I know that board members really want to be, for the most part, board members want to be effective. And I tap into their motivation and caring about the mission to be doing the right thing. And I get a good reception. And so for the executive, when I'm coaching executives, we talk about strategies for how they can help their board understand those roles. I also have some tools in an online course, Board Orientation Success, which, you just send your board members to do my course and they'll get it because that's my training. And they can do it at their own time and you'll have it forever. So that's a tool that a lot of my clients use too. So I hope that answers. Now, what was the second question?
Let's see. The second question was, what are some of the struggles that you experience or you've seen either as a former ED or in your management roles?
Oh, okay. My management roles. Well, when I was CEO, I ran ultimately, I was the CEO for 26 years, folks. So I've lived from a very small nonprofit with 6 part-time people and grew up, I like to say, in nonprofits, growing that organization. And then we did 2 mergers and I ended up running a nonprofit with 530 staff. So I've been there, done that for almost everything you'd experience. The challenges that I hear are board members not knowing the lane they belong in, some power struggles, challenges because board members don't understand the role, or they are over-promising, they're not negotiating their capacity with the executive. So, things like micromanagement, being absent, not being engaged as a board member. Of course, executives are challenged with personnel issues all the time. I get that, and my clients that I coach have issues like that. Again, I'm not, in my book, I present all of the problems that you could have with your board and stories about those troubles and 3 areas that they all fall into. Any problem you have with the board is going to fall into one of those 3 areas, and then what you can do about it. So if I'm not rattling it all off, you're going to have problems with capacity. Just, do I have enough help? Do I have enough people? You're going to have trouble with the relationships with each board member, with the board as a whole, and with your board chair. You're going to have trouble. You could, I don't mean you're going to, I'm sorry. And you're going to have trouble with board culture. And this is about the beliefs and assumptions that people have and how that interferes with their ability to be effective leaders. And so whatever problems you're having, they probably fit into one of those. So I've seen them all. There's a lot of stories in the book about executive, all real stories about how these things have played out. So I don't know if that's enough, but hopefully it is.
We received another question, and the question is, do you touch on board giving with board members?
Yes, I do. I'm not a fundraiser. If your development directors out there, you're the experts on this, but often in the training, I'll highlight this if I'm doing it in person. It's also a message that's in my course, Board Orientation Success. I really want to deliver messages I know executives want their board members to hear, because it's hard for you to deliver these messages. So I tell board members that if fundraising is part of your financial model, you need to start there. Your board members need to understand your sources of revenue, amounts of revenue. If fundraising is part of that, then the board members, two things. They must give a cash gift every year that is significant for them. Now, this is personal opinion, okay? You must give, because who else is going to give? Why could you ask somebody else to give if you're not giving? It's outrageous to think. And now, I ran a mental health organization for years, and we had people on our board who had experienced mental illness. Not everybody on our board had lots of money, okay? So just because someone doesn't have a lot of money doesn't mean you're going to insult them by telling them, you know, they're poor and they can't give. The key is to give something that's significant for them, and I don't care if it's $5. Your board members need to give you a cash gift every year, but I wanted to address that objection. I don't recommend that you set an amount for that reason. You want a diverse board. Not everybody is going to be economically in the same place, right? The other thing is that they need to be involved, but board members need to understand, and this is where the mistake is. When I get in front of board members and say, what do you think about, what comes up for you when we talk about you fundraising? They all get knots in their stomachs and they talk about asking for money. Let your board know. I mean, if you email me, I have a free thing called How to Engage Your Board in Fundraising. I'll send you. Your board members need to understand that 90% of how they can help you fundraise is in relationship building. Now that's oversimplified, but they need to get it that frankly, they don't have to make the ask if they're uncomfortable. Now, you want board members on your board who are going to lead in this area, who are comfortable asking, but you want everyone to know if they're not comfortable, they don't have to do it. It's about making connections. It's about nurturing and stewarding relationships, saying thank you, leveraging you, because there's a lot more of them out there to do that stewardship. So I'm going to stop. I think we're out of time. I see Kathy here. Are we okay?
Thank you so much, Mary. Yes.
Thank you all.
I'm getting lots of messages about your podcast.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to plug, just give an umbrella about, what and how often it occurs.
It's once a week, every Thursday morning. This morning, a new episode came out. Every Thursday, you can grab it wherever you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe, and I'd love it if you would write a review once you listen to an episode. I know that if you go into iTunes or Apple Podcasts, you probably can see a list of the topics. If you want to be on it, again, email me, mary@hilandconsulting.org, and I'm happy to chat with you or email back and forth about that.
I'm going to put your email in the chat. So it's mary@hilandconsulting.org. And Shake, thank you. You just put in the chat a link to the, on my website, hilandconsulting.org. There's a whole page with all the podcasts on it. So you can go to hilandconsulting.org//podcast/episodes or episode, I think. But Shake put it in the chat. That's a direct link to the page on my website. And that's your email address I just put in there. So, wow.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to just jump in and ask real quick? Okay, so it looks like we're covered. I really want to thank you, Mary. This has been really informative,
Oh,
really
yeah.
helpful.
Thank
And
you.
you touched on, I know, a lot of what I hear people struggle with. So thank you.
Okay.
Really
Okay,
appreciate that.
somebody in the chats wanted the link to how to engage your board and fire. You need to email me, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, and I put her email in there if you want to.
Whatever. Thank you for the feedback. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity, and bless you all for the work that you're doing. You're so important. You
Thank you
are
so much,
each
Mary.
important.
Can
Okay.
I, in
Bye-bye.
January, in our next meeting, we are lucky to have Robin Farr. You may have known her from TV30, and Tracy Farhad, the executive director of Visit Tri-Valley. And Robin's part of her team, and we'll have our social media director, and they're experts in marketing and communications. And so in January, those will be our speakers. We'll let you know if it's in person or on Zoom. Anyway, thank you everybody for showing up. And thank you again, Mary. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye, everybody.